What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So the new champion IVERN is finally out on the PB and I got a chance to mess around with him and play quite a few games on stream actually, try him out in just a ton of different builds, a ton of different roles, and overall I really do have to say that he's a very interesting character and has a lot of really interesting design tropes and just mechanics in general. And so today we're taking a look and trying to find out just how OP IVERN actually is. And just a heads up, I'm going to be doing a giveaway with some friends. We're giving away about $100 of RP as well as a gaming chair and like some peripherals like keyboard, headset, mouse and stuff. It's going to be super easy to enter. Just check the link in the description. And if you enjoyed the video, leave a like and let's get started. Now IVERN is a champion that is pretty much certainly designed to be played in the jungle. He plays a lot more of like a supportive jungle style rather than like a carry jungle style, or maybe is like a farm heavy jungle style. He does have a lot of interesting counter jungling options though. But something I discovered when I was playing him is that he actually has really interesting and honestly just really good potential to be played as like a support, because he can do a lot of like really gimmicky stuff in the bot lane and really actually be played as a lot of like interesting combos, and he has some really cool synergies and stuff. Now jumping into his abilities, so his passive is probably the most ridiculous part of his kit to say the least, and honestly it's just ridiculously strong once you actually have smite, especially when it comes to counter jungling. His passive makes him a counter jungling monster, and with it you can pull off invades like crazy because you can kill entire jungle camps in just like 3 seconds, including the buffs. So it really makes you a super powerful counter jungler. You just kill the camp so goddamn fast, it's awesome. However, when you don't actually have your smite up, his passive isn't necessarily all that good. It's a little bit tricky to say the least, and it also makes him very vulnerable to invades because it is a very high health cost and mana cost as well actually, especially at level 1. And the fact that he can get invaded so easily because he's kind of immobile and he's a very poor duelist is probably his biggest weakness, I would say, or at least like the biggest weakness that would be relevant at the competitive level of play. Is something that's kind of shared between a decent amount of junglers though. And it's interesting though, because his counter jungling is so good, you can kind of like outplay invades by like doing a counter invade or doing all sorts of really crazy strategies. The passive is pretty complicated though, so for those of you who don't know, I would say check the ability previews. And as for his Q, it's actually a very cool ability, probably my favorite ability on his kit actually. It does a pretty decent amount of damage, like the base scaling is okay, and the AP ratio is what I believe is 0.7. However, the cooldown is kind of long, so it's not a very reliable tool for damage in a one-on-one fight, and you're going to see throughout the rest of his kit that he doesn't really have very many reliable tools for damage overall. But the utility of his Q is actually just so cool, and it also gives him really amazing potential to be played in the support role actually, because it actually can potentially make it possible to maybe even go bottom with a melee carry, because it gives your allies a gap closer, which is something that is just so unique, and it's a very new mechanic to the game, something we haven't really seen before in an aggressive way at least. Like we've seen Thresh kind of giving his allies mobility in like a very defensive oriented way, but you know, IVERN's Q is all about the aggression and it lets your allies gap close like crazy. The root is really awesome, the range is actually really big as well, the hitbox is pretty small, but overall it's a really awesome ability and probably the most potent ability in his kit really, except for his passive of course. Now his W is something that I had a little bit of trouble getting used to. Now it's a very gimmicky sort of spell, like it's not necessarily all that practical, or at least it's not nearly as practical as you might think. So spawning bushes it's kind of interesting, right? Because there's a lot of like kind of quirks and stuff that you don't necessarily think about. Like for example, your opponents can use the bushes the exact same way you do. So there's, if you don't use it properly or if you don't set up the fights correctly, you can find yourself getting outplayed in your own bushes by your opponents, which results in the ability being quite difficult to use overall. The damage on the passive effect on the W is also very low, so it doesn't really give him all that source of a reliable damage. And the vision elements, like the way the vision works with the bush is kind of weird because, so for the first 3 seconds the bush is revealed, which means you can use the bush ability to face check at like a really long range. You can use it almost as like a ward, honestly, kind of, for like the first 3 seconds at least, but it also makes it a little bit more difficult to use it to actually juke out opponents in the middle of a fight because it's revealed for the first 3 seconds to both teams. So as a result, it's not necessarily the best tool to use defensively or for juking or stuff like that because it requires a little bit of setup, but it does make his objective play or some sort of positioning strategies really interesting. It gives them a lot of really cool strategies for cover as long as you have enough time to set up or position. Like for example, maybe if you're sieging a lane, you can set up a huge row of bushes and just use that as cover and juke in and out of them and do stuff like that. The E is really cool, but it can also be kind of difficult to land sometimes because it has a really short range, but it's also a really powerful slow. And so it's another thing that actually gives him a pretty interesting combo possibility in a duo lane with a melee carry. And it really gives him a lot of synergies with quite a few champions that have gap closers of just like jumping in, landing the E, and it just lets them stick to the target so well. And it's the kind of ability that works really well with certain champions, but with other champions, it's kind of just a generic shield that doesn't really do anything other than soak up a little bit of damage. So it's kind of, again, another situational ability on him. As for the ultimate though, I do have to say that it's honestly probably the most underwhelming thing about him. Like the ability is pretty clunky, like the controls are really weird. There's a lot of times where you try to control the ultimate to move in a certain spot and it moves to that spot, but then once it gets there, just like stands still and does nothing rather than actually attacking the targets next to it. So I guess part of it can definitely be chalked up to the fact that I wasn't that good at controlling it, but the controls are kind of counterintuitive. Like it's not going to attack anything unless you actually tell it to, even like minions and towers and stuff. You'll tell it to move next to the tower and it'll just stand there. So it requires a little bit of getting used to in terms of the controls. It also doesn't really do all that much damage, and the knockup effect on it is something that, although is really good because it's an area of effect knockup, it's actually something that misses just all the time because it's very slow, it's very telegraphed, the hitbox is pretty small, and overall the fact that the ultimate is a little bit underwhelming or maybe just a little bit weird is probably the biggest factor that I believe makes him feel, what I'm gonna say my opinion on him is that he feels a little bit weak at the moment in the state that I played him, but I do believe he will probably get buffed before being released on the live client. And his mechanics are quite situational, so it can be a little bit weird. You know, he's going to do poorly with certain champions, but a lot better with others. So he has a lot of potential as like a niche role and can make some plays happen. Overall, though, I definitely had a lot of fun playing with him. I mean, as far as build paths go, I would not follow the build paths that you're seeing in the footage right now. So the footage that I have for this video is just taken from my stream, and when I play new champions, I like to just try all sorts of crazy stuff and a lot of really good builds, bad builds, etc. You know, I tried out pretty much every build that I could think of, and I do think that mobility boots are going to be really core on him. And Rylai's is a really cool item because it procs on his W slow, it also procs on his ultimate creature, but since he's a very supportive jungler because his damage overall is not very high, I think like a full support build is actually going to be probably the most meta build, like stuff like Locket, maybe like a Sightstone even, Banner of Command, like a really support heavy sort of build because his damage efficiency with damage stats is actually really poor. Like even though his ratios aren't necessarily the worst, the fact that his Q has such a long cooldown and his ultimate scaling on AP is pretty terrible makes it so that even when you build damage, you're not going to be dealing damage. So either a support build or a tank build is definitely going to be the way to go. Maybe an AP tank build could work out because the AP tank items like Rylai's are very, very strong in the meta right now. Overall, though, it's a little bit tricky because he is pretty gimmicky. He has a lot of situational moves that aren't necessarily the best. And his potential in the bot lane, though, is kind of wacky, really cheesy, but it's something that I would definitely look out for because it could actually be really good. Even though his passive might not necessarily be all that useful in the bot lane, you can pull off some really crazy strategies with melee carries, even with just straight up AD carries as well. His counter jungling, too, is just incredible. He's probably the best counter jungler in the game, to be honest. But as a trade-off, he's really vulnerable to invades, and because of his low base stats, because of his poor damage scaling, his poor damage efficiency is probably the better term to use, he does tend to have trouble dueling, so counter jungling is quite risky on him, even though he can take camps pretty much instantly. He's got crazy good synergies with certain types of champions though, especially melee carries in particular. You know, there was a lot of times that I thought were really cool where I was trying to do a camp or maybe invade my opponent, and a couple opponent champions would collapse on me, and then my allies would also come and join me, and then I could use my Q, and then my allies would get a gap close and we just blow them up instantly. You know, there's a lot of synergies that work out with him, and he can definitely find like a super niche place in certain team comps. You know, he's very a niche sort of pick. He's not like a general guy that you can just blind pick into any matchup and expect to do optimally with him. But overall, he's a really cool champion. He's got some really awesome and interesting mechanics, really. And also, fun fact, his W of creating a bush actually used to be an original ability that was designed and intended for Caitlyn, actually, about 6 years ago. And at the time, they just didn't really have the technology, and it wasn't necessarily the right fit of an ability for an AD carry, so they decided to just scrap it, and now we see it 6 years later on IVERN. So that's a really cool piece of trivia for you guys. You can surprise your friends with that one. And overall, though, I was really impressed with his like thematics and just design in general, and the fact that he does really feel extremely unique and just such an interesting character that is just so new and honestly really felt pretty fresh to play. And honestly, I'm probably going to stream some more games with him in the next couple days, so if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely maybe check out the streams. I'll probably be live a couple hours from this video, and I'm trying to stream every day now, at least to the best of my ability, for at least a few hours, so, you know, enjoy the streams if you happen to stop by. And either way, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on what you think about IVERN overall. Either way, that's going to be it for me. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you want, and I'll see you guys next time.